Hello and welcome. Oh, how I wish we were all together in the same room. I'm sure we'd all like to be with familiar and new as well as old faces, but here we are in Zoom land. My name is Greg Mancios. I'm the founding dean of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, the 25th and newest school of CUNY, the school that's dedicated to public service and social justice. It's my pleasure, an honor really, to be welcoming you today to Carry It On, a tribute to the life and work of Stanley Aronowitz. We have over 1,400 participants in today's conference. That's an enormous number for a conference like this, yet it's minuscule relative to the number of people who have been influenced by Stanley's work and persona. Among so many other things, Stanley Aronowitz was Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Urban Education at the CUNY Graduate Center. He was also consortial faculty member at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. At SLU, he helped us establish the school, served on our governing body, and taught our students. It was because Stanley inspired so many students and faculty, and because he played such an important role in both institutions, that the Graduate Center and SLU decided to co-sponsor today's conference. We did so because we wanted to contribute to the preservation of Stanley's legacy. We want future generations of scholars and activists to learn from Stanley's work, not only to learn from the substance of his teachings, but to learn his way of integrating activism and scholarship. It's in that context, I take great pleasure in introducing you to the president of the Graduate School and University Center and a wonderful and dear colleague, Dr. Robin Gorell, who will join me in welcoming all of you. Robin.
Thank you, Greg. The Graduate Center is proud to co-sponsor this conference with you and the School of Labor and Urban Studies to honor the work of Distinguished Professor Stanley Aronowitz. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Professors Ruth Milkman and Lynn Chancer from the Graduate Center for helping to plan this event. And I also extend thanks to everyone on the Conference Planning Committee and the Graduate Center Office of Public Programs for making this event possible. Professor Aronowitz joined the Graduate Center faculty in 1983 and was named Distinguished Professor in 1998. Professor Aronowitz taught in our doctoral program in sociology, as well as in the master's program in liberal studies. He was one of the founders of our PhD program in urban education, and he directed the Center for the Study of Culture, Technology, and Work. Aronowitz was a scholar whose interests spanned labor and social movements, education, science and technology, and social theory. He connected his scholarship with action and engagement in labor and civil rights movements. He was an originator and leader, serving as the founding editor of the journal Social Text and founding one of the very first experimental high schools in New York City. As a scholar, activist, teacher, and mentor, Professor Aronowitz exemplified so much of what the Graduate Center is known for. He epitomized the reason that students choose the Graduate Center to pursue advanced research. He connected with them. He was original, engaging, and enthusiastic. And he mentored hundreds of students. He taught them to push their work forward, to use their graduate education to address challenges in our society and to make the world better. This is the heart of graduate education for the public good at the Graduate Center. Our students, alumni, and faculty are carrying on this important work, and we are proud to be with all of you today to honor Professor Aronowitz and his commitment to fighting injustice and to educating and inspiring new leaders. Thank you so much for being here today. And now I turn the mic back over to you, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Conference Planning Committee, Karen Sandler, the head of public programming at the graduate school, Lynn Schauntzer, the chair of the sociology department there, Michael Pelias from LIU at Brooklyn, Ruth Milkman, distinguished professor at the GC and chair of labor studies at SLU, Paula Finn, director of SLU Center for Labor and Community, Michael Lallan, who coordinates our public programming, and Nadia Rahman, who assisted throughout the process. You'll hear from Lynn, Michael, and Ruth shortly. Let me just say, as we start here, Stanley wore so many hats in the course of his lifetime. He was a metal worker, he was a union organizer, he was a cultural critic, an educator, an activist, a scholar, and such a prolific author. There were other descriptors as well, college dropout, disruptor, failed gubernatorial candidate, count-wise, he failed miserably, in fact, but he always wore those distinctions as badges of honor as well, and he had good reasons. On a personal note, my path crossed with Stanley's over the course of 45 years. We were at the same demonstrations and same planning meetings in the 70s. He was a guy who I read and whose lectures I attended and who influenced my thinking about the labor movement. He was even an adversary when some of us hatched plans to launch a labor college 30 years ago. They were competing plans, and in fact, both plans failed miserably at that point. But he was a co-conspirator when we successfully established the Murphy Institute 16 years ago, and then the School of Labor and Urban Studies 3 years ago. And, Stanley was a colleague, but he was also a friend. I will always remember him for his continued kindness. When I was dealing with a protracted loss of a loved one. And yes, our paths crossed so many times over the course of nearly a half a century. And yet until the last day I saw him, I felt I was just getting to know him. I suspect that all of us will get to know Stanley Aronowitz a lot better by the end of the day. And we're going to start with our keynote speaker, who needs no introduction to this audience or to any audience for that matter. I want to welcome another great scholar, activist, public intellectual, rabble-rouser, and always inspiring Cornel West.
Thank you so much, my dear brother Greg and sister Robin. What a blessing, what an honor to be here. I am not only humbled, but in so many ways you can imagine, I'm heavy at heart on the one hand and also full of joy on the other, which is very much being true to my very, very dear brother Stanley, because he was always ebullient, joyful, somebody who would uplift you, but you knew that he was in many ways carrying so much of the world on his shoulders. When I think of my dear brother Stanley, I just loved him so very, very dearly, just like he loved me. And I respected him so very, very deeply, just like he respected me. We were brothers to the bone, 42 years. I would take a bullet for him. He would take a bullet for me. Now he's 20 years older than me, so he was a kind of uncle, but he always treated me as an equal. And that's very, very rare anywhere in the world, let alone in New York City. When I think of Brother Stanley, though, I think of what the Greeks said about Socrates. They call him metapos, unsubsumable, unclassifiable, no label, no category could begin to describe his richness, his complexity, his depth, his scope, his breadth, his personality. He was as unique and singular as they come. And yet at the same time, he was so down to earth. He was in love with those Sly Stone called everyday people. Poor and working people sat at the very center of his sense of who he was, not just as a thinker, but as a human being. I would say unequivocally, Stanley Aronowitz was the greatest organic intellectual of his generation. And if Antonio Gramsci had not invented the term, we would have had to invent it in order to begin to account for who Stanley Aronowitz was, what his calling was, what his vocation was in the midst of an American empire, in the midst of a predatory capitalist civilization. You could argue, in fact, that he's one of the greatest organic intellectuals in the history of the country. And again, by organic intellectual, what I mean is somebody whose commitment to the life of the mind is absolute. And somebody's commitment to the empowerment of poor and working people, absolute. And someone's commitment to finding joy in that intellectual vocation and in that political engagement. So that Brother Stanley Aronowitz, he, for me, is to be understood always and tied to a quest for truth. And for him, following Adorno in those early moments of negative dialectics, what he says, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, which is an echo of Hebrew scripture. Stanley Aronowitz's commitment to a quest for beauty, and truth is inseparable from beauty, but not identical with beauty. And hence we'll see his fundamental preoccupation, not just with culture, but with music, with Beethoven. Roll Over Beethoven was the name of one of his books. Shostakovich Symphony 10, he'd hear over and over and over again, and he was a jazz man to the core of his being, not just hanging out at Birdland, not just hanging out with Paradise and Small in Harlem as we did, but someone who took it seriously as a way of understanding reality, catastrophe, crisis, generating sustenance, resilience, resistance, quest for truth, quest for beauty, and yes, quest for goodness too. Quest for goodness too, the ethical, the moral, inseparable from the beautiful and the truthful. Scientific truth, existential truth, all of that part and parcel of Brother Stanley's Weltanschauung, of his overarching worldview. And in an interesting kind of way, Stanley and I, over the 42 years, we had many, many discussions about a variety of different issues. We would have wonderful fights over religion. He knew about my own revolutionary Christian sensibility. And Stanley was one of the most religiously musical secular intellectuals that I knew. That he was somebody who could put himself in the skin of persons who were still tied to a certain kind of God talk, a certain kind of faith talk. That's what allowed him to be organic to the Black freedom struggle. That's what allowed him to be assigned by Baird Rustin and A. Philip Randolph to be the person to bring in the trade union movement and the March on Washington in 1963 when he was only 29 years old. It was the same Stanley that could go into a Black church, and I've seen him do it over and over again and move Black folk at the deepest level of their souls because he emptied himself. He gave of himself rhetorically and existentially and connected with them in their church, even given his secular sensibilities coming out of the Jewish side of the Bronx. That rich secular Jewish tradition that Stanley was fundamentally shaped by and grounded in, but his roots, his R-O-O-T-S, as rich as they were continually, was broad. So it connected him with the routes that he took. So he was a cosmopolitan, an internationalist, a globalist to his heart, even as he was a localist, even as he was grounded in everyday struggle, even as he was grounded in grassroots organizing his whole life. Where do you begin? Talking about Brother Stanley, I think of T.S. Eliot's Raid on the Ineffable. Language fails. Words will fall short. Even given this magnificent day, Stanley's too much. He reminds me of Henry Adams' Dynamo. That's Brother Stanley. Volcanic energy. You think of Keats's fundamental question, energy or despair, Keats says in one of those wonderful poems. Stanley, energy, vitality, vibrancy, all the way live, always engaged, and yet on intimate terms with the darkness, on intimate terms with the underside, the night side, on that wonderful line of Tennessee Williams in The Night of the Iguana, the unlighted side of the human condition. Stanley Aronowitz, my dear brother Stanley, always connected to the unlighted side, the suffering, the misery of working people, not just in the American empire, but every corner of the globe, Africa, Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, Europe, indigenous peoples, cross national borders, unlighted condition, underside, and yet always looking for a way out. I think in order to begin to grasp who Brother Stanley was, I mean, we'd have to go back, of course, to his blessed mother and parents. We'd have to go back to his formation in the Bronx. We'd have to go back to going to that high school for the arts, that rich artistic sensibility he would have his whole life. Brooklyn College, as Brother Gregory's saying, being pushed out of Brooklyn College because of his organic relation to everyday people, demonstrating in the streets, going to New Jersey, becoming part of the trade union movement, spending that time in Puerto Rico, working with the amalgamated workers, always reading, always educating himself. He was a walking paideia, to use the Greek term for deep education, not cheap schooling. That's why what our dear brother Henry Giroux, who probably knew Stanley intellectually better than most, continually made the juxtaposition against schooling for deep paideia, deep build on, deep education, suspicious of narrow information, truncated skill acquisition, and much more concerned with the transformative process by which we engage in critical thinking. Critical pedagogy has everything to do with the formation of attention, attending to the things that matter, separating it from the superficial levels that too often constitute the source of our attention: life, death, sorrow, agony, anguish, justice, death, dread, despair, disappointment, family, community, civic affiliation. How do we mobilize whatever intellectual, moral, spiritual, political resources we can in order to live well, which is to say live with moral and spiritual excellence, what the Greeks call arete. Stanley exemplified a moral and spiritual and political excellence. And excellence here is understood as a virtue, and virtue is a verb. virtues of verbs, let me say, as well as dispositions of behavior. So Stanley's always in motion, like Curtis Mayfield. He's always keeping on pushing. He's always moving. He's full of attempts to connect the kenosis, the emptying that he was, the pouring out of what was inside of him, but always connecting it to others to enable and to empower them. And I am a living example. I will always fall short of my dear brother Stanley's example. When I conceive of my own work, given my own formation, it's so often over against not just the 42 years of Stanley's examples, but those very, very deep and intimate conversations over pizza every Friday night from 1979 until I made my way to New England with Social Text, the Journal with Frederick Jameson and Richard Wolff, Steve Resnick, and Anders Stephenson, and Sonia Sayers, and Nancy, meeting every 2 weeks. And then Stanley's lectures at Columbia and NYU on science is power, and his attempt to engage in such profound connections of scientific rationality on the one hand, and how it's under the aegis of capital in its relation to the university as a site for professional managerial production, as a knowledge factory that has its own narrow disciplinary divisions of knowledge and disciplines that make it very, very difficult for the kind of intellectual work that Stanley was interested in. Why? Because that kind of specialization and professionalization and fragmentation and differentiation makes it very hard for Stanley to transmit to the younger generation what he was about in terms of synoptic vision, synthetic analysis, synecdochic imagination. A synecdoche, of course, is a rhetorical trope that has to do with relation of parts and wholes and the ways in which parts are interdependent, intertwined, and interrelated. And yet the whole is always more than the sum of the parts. And when that synoptic vision, synthetic analysis, and synecdochic imagination in the service of a radical imagination, radical democracy, in the service of a militant activism, shattering conformity, shattering complacency, shattering complicity, most importantly, shattering what his hero, C. Wright Mills, called moral cowardliness in the academy. And it's no accident that Stanley's next to last book was on one of his own heroes, the iconoclastic, idiosyncratic sociologist at Columbia, riding his motorcycle with his hat from Texas, C. Wright Mills, dead at 44, but lived at least 2 lifetimes in terms of the scope of his production. Stanley was very influenced by that C. Wright Mills, who in his classic of 1959, The Sociological Imagination, had his critique of that abstract empiricism, of the abstract theory that had very little to do with the lived experience of suffering and struggling poor and working people. I think Stanley's text of 1981 really requires a serious rereading. The Crisis in Historical Materialism, Class, Politics, and Culture in Marxist Theory. We've yet to really catch up with that text. It's one of the most important texts in the history of the American left and the history of American Marxist theory. I remember writing a review of it in the January issue of Village Voice in 1982. The text appeared in 1981. And I started off saying it's a book that's in a class of its own, that it is pioneering in its theoretical formulations. It is powerful in its philosophical interrogations. It is penetrating in its social analysis, historical analysis, and it's provocative in its prescription for political action. Because what Stanley was doing there, he was writing at a time in which the left was wrestling with the French occupation of its mind, in which Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze and Lyotard and other persons highly suspicious of any notions of totality, any notions of synecdochic ways of thinking were becoming hegemonic. And with Fred Jameson on the one hand, so deeply tied to Lukács, and Stanley Aronowitz on the other, deeply tied to Lukács, trying to recover some notion of totality, not as an ontological notion, not at all. They were following Adorno, it's a heuristic, but it's a lens through which you still have a sense of the whole, as our universities, as knowledge factories, were becoming places where any sense of what the forest looked like was called into question, and more people were concerned with just shining their little narrow nuts in a corner. So the students who come through have very little sense of what is the relation between personal and political, existential and economic, social and the spiritual. What is the relation between the nation state and the capitalist economy and the civic sphere and everyday life? What is the relation between one's personal problems that might lead one to go to the psychiatrist and the structural and institutional crises, and how intertwined they are, the problematic, again, in many ways, of C. Wright Mills and others. Stanley Aronowitz was true to his vocation. He took seriously those two essays by Max Weber in 1917 and 1919, Science as a Vocation, Politics as a Vocation. And when Weber divided the ethics of responsibility with the ethics of conviction, Stanley says, I am going to provide a line between social democratic reformism and dogmatic Leninism so that the left can understand its sense of vocation is always already rooted in an ethics of conviction, but our ethics of responsibility will not be the compromise that Weber talked about. It will be itself a way of continually trying to subvert the ways in which we view the world, the ways in which we organize, and the ways in which we try to fit into narrow two-party politics, or fit into truncated electoral politics, or simply fit into an accommodating academy. So that this radical imagination that he has, rooted in vocation, but also immersed in an interpretation of the left tradition. His sense of history, deep. And he, like myself, we come from a very small sliver of the Marxist tradition. They're called council communists. We spent many evenings talking about Gorder and Panico, talking about the great Rosa Luxemburg. In fact, I would argue there's a sense in which Brother Stanley Aronowitz is an American analog to the great Rosa Luxemburg. And there's no Rosa Luxemburg, that nobody close to her in a variety of different ways. But trying to find ways in which this vanguardism of Lenin is called into question. So you go down with the sailors of Kronstadt, Soviets without Bolsheviks, workers' council without professional revolutionary. We want self-management. We want self-education of the workers. We want self-governance of the workers. We don't need those external vanguards who in their elitist way impose their will upon everyday people. Council communists, like Musty's American Workers' Party, like Paul Maddox, that small sliver. Stanley would spend much time in his journal, Root and Branch, in the 60s, come back again in social text, come back again in situations, trying to keep alive that council communist, radically democratic, all the way down orientation, but still revolutionary. We had many discussions with, of course, Brother Michael Harrington and our dear sister Frances Fox Piven and Richard Cloud and Barbara Ehrenreich and Manny Marable. Those were some wonderful, wonderful days. But it was a matter of somehow trying to keep the reformers under questioning so they don't become comfortable with their reformism. And at the same time, hold at arm's length any of the dogmatic vanguardists whose elitism too often was a sign of their arrogance vis-a-vis everyday people, vis-a-vis working people and poor people. And Stanley provided a grand example of inhabiting that space. It more and more began, we talked about it, just revolutionary and radical democracy, but it's really a council communist tradition. And Stanley was very, very explicit about that. And it had fascinating relations, of course, to the anarchist tradition. And even C. Wright Mills would say, deep down, I really am an anarchist. Bayard Rustin says, of course, I'm an anarchist. Interesting, interesting. In that text, The Crisis in Historical Materialism, Stanley tries to take very seriously what he always viewed as a fundamental part of himself, which was the Black freedom movement. He's one of the rare vanilla leftist intellectuals, vanilla Marxist intellectuals who would spend time, not just in the context of the Black freedom movement, but in his text. How does white supremacy, how does the racist dynamics of a predatory capitalist civilization, the racist dynamics of a settler colonial experiment called the USA, how does that connect with radical thinking and radical politics? And of course, Sister Ellen Willis, I mean, she's one of the great and towering intellectuals wrestling with patriarchy and male supremacy in her own unique feminist way. You got this dynamic duel in the same household. You know, I was blessed to spend a whole lot of time in that household, very much so. In fact, they were both of my, the wedding that I had at Union Seminary. In fact, one of my contributions was I had Stanley teaching at Union Theological Seminary in 1979. That's the first time you had such a towering Jewish secular figure teaching in the Christian seminary. And the students loved him. They packed his classes. And he would bring Ellen with her own unique feminist formulations. You see. So that Stanley's embracing of the social movements tied to so-called identity politics, but you read his book on the politics of identity and you see it's still so much deeper than any of the neoliberal conceptions of identity politics these days, are so much deeper than so many of the theorists these days, because it's always tied to class, it's tied to empire, and it's tied to culture as a force in and over against the worst of what we see in capitalist civilization and in the imperial project that commenced when the Europeans arrived vis-a-vis indigenous people dispossessing their land and subordinating their peoples. So Stanley has this overarching view that connects the parts and the wholes, an analysis in which is not just intersectional, but it is constitutive of a larger regime that is tied to profit maximizing and this is where Murray Bookchin plays an important role in his thinking, a domination of nature, a subordination of environment or the non-human. And Stanley in 1981 has a whole section on the ecological catastrophe and that challenge to Marxist theory. So you got to rethink scientific rationality as a mode of dominating nature and hence coming up with what forms of knowledge can be produced that allow us to view nature as a thou rather than an it, to invoke the language of our dear brother Martin Buber. Stanley Reynolds was already raising those questions 41 years ago. And look at the mess that we find ourselves now. How do we cultivate the capacity of the species to avoid self-destruction with the corporate greed running amok, with the inability to have democratic accountability of elites obsessed with money making and could actually undercut the possibility of life on the planet. Brother Stanley was raising that question. That's part of the underside, the unlighted side that Stanley was on intimate terms with, even given his endless smile and what Du Bois would call his delicious chuckle. Stanley's laugh was a sublime activity. It could not but kindle inside of the soul of anyone who heard it something positive, something uplifting. And yet he knew in his vocation, in his calling, everything was at stake. Everything. Life on the planet, a decent life for the masses, a majority of human beings on the planet. And for him, intellectually, artistically, the higher qualities of being human. And the higher qualities of being human in this sense made Stanley in some ways an old school intellectual. He was very much tied to the Socratic legacy of Athens and that self-interrogation and self-examination as a mode of self-transformation. He was very tied to the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, in which that Hebrew scripture said, spread hesed, spread that loving kindness and steadfast love to the orphan and widow, to the fatherless and motherless, and be in solidarity with those who are oppressed, and given his secular twist on that formulation. It said at the center of who he was. And so when he talked about the tradition, he talked, yes, about the lived experiences of poor people. He talked about the cultural products of poor people and working people. But he also talked about the canon and the classical text. That when Brother Jim Frados and I would go see Brother Stanley in the wheelchair, and he'd be sitting there talking nonstop about some new classical work he'd read on Spinoza. He was teaching a class on Spinoza's ethics. We walked with him, wheelchair and all the way to the People's Hall from his apartment. And he's teaching a class on Marx's Grundrisse methodology in Marxist theory. How do you provide lens through which you keep track of the asymmetric relations of domination at the workplace and the various ways in which class struggle is articulated in cultural forms? How do you keep track of the emerging fascism? Brother Stanley wrote a book in 1970 on the nature of fascism. It's called Honor America, The Nature of Fascism, 52 years ago, because he knew, like Sinclair Lewis, it can happen here. Yes, fascism always already at work within the democratic, so-called democratic experiment, vis-a-vis indigenous peoples and slavery and Jim Crow and Jane Crow, and vicious patriarchal subordination and ugly degradation of precious gays and lesbian and non-binary, you see. And so for Stanley, right-wing populism in the American empire easily shade into a full-scale fascist project. So when he saw Trump, he was not surprised at all. And he thought the left had spent so much time talking about issues that were not deeply connected to capitalist processes, to class struggle, and to the militarism of the US empire in Africa, at AFRICOM, as well as the 800 military bases around the world. And he also thought the left was too obsessed with critique and didn't talk as much about construction and alternatives. That's why he ran for governor. He called me up, Brother Cornel, I'm running for governor. You running for governor? Good God Almighty, you've been running all your life, now you're running for governor? Oh, Lord, Green Party. Oh, that's Brother Stanley. Indeed, that's Brother Stanley. Why? We've got to provide some way of getting beyond this narrow view of there is no alternative to the capitalist order. Margaret Thatcher's wrong. There's got to be an alternative. And people have to see it. They have to hear it in the language, hear it with the vision, hear it with the analysis. And there must be intellectuals who are articulating it within the context of movement, organic intellectuals. And I want to bring this to a close, but you can see I'm just touching the surface of the genius of my brother. And by genius, I don't mean some romantic notion of an isolated individual who has this unbelievable cognitive capacity. No, I mean it in the Russian sense. And Stanley was deeply Russian. I would push for Chekhov. He would push for Dostoevsky, and we would fight over Dostoevsky versus Chekhov for hour after hour after hour. But the Russians had a notion of geniality when they talked about genius, largeness of mind, largeness of soul, largeness of heart, largeness of commitment, and for Stanley, largeness of courage. He never sold out. He never became well-adjusted to injustice and well-adapted to indifference. He knew that indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weak. He knew that indifference, the evil, is more insidious than evil himself. He remained full of that style, that joy, that commitment, that vision, that engagement, that sense of being alive and glad of being alive in such a hellish world. I would tell him all the time, I say, brother, when I grew up in the Black church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, we were told if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. Brother Stanley left heaven behind in his own distinctive secular Jewish way that we shall never forget. And so much of his heaven is in my heart, is in my soul. And I will never, ever forget my brother Stanley's love for me and others, his service to me and others, and his intellectual commitment to trying to find a way out, given the kind of multi-level catastrophes in which we find ourselves. So I know this day is going to be a beautiful thing, and we just say, love you, Brother Stanley. Never forget you, Brother Stanley. Thank you for being so many years in our life, in my life, and we commit ourselves. I know I commit myself to building on his rich, multidimensional legacy.
Thank you. Thank you, Cornel West. You never disappoint, you never fail. You always enlighten, you always inspire. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. There's Sister Nona, there she is. Prize winning Nona, yes she is. Oh, Stanley loved her so. Oh Lord, so did Ellen. Oh Lord, yes, indeed.
Thank you.